All right, so good morning, welcome back. For those of you just joining, my name is Magnus Bäck. I work for Access Communications with development tools and various CI-related matters. And this talk is about the Eiffel Broadcaster Jenkins plugin, which obviously makes Jenkins more Eiffel aware. So I'm going to show. Well, let's see if I can have time to actually show what it works, how it works. But I'll have some slides to explain things. So the agenda will include how activities are modeled, and also how to inject Eiffel links to builds that you start through the HTTP API. In other words, from other tools or manually. We'll also talk about how you can send Eiffel events from your pipelines, and finally, the various helpers for publishing artifacts. So Jenkins builds are being modeled with activities, unsurprisingly. So when Jenkins receives a build request, it'll send an activity triggered. When the build actually starts, we get an activity started. When it finishes, an activity finished. That's sort of textbook how Eiffel works. The activity triggered message will get information about causes and triggers as best as the plugin can deduce. So, for example, if it was started by a source change, that will be indicated. If it was started because of a scheduled job, like a cron job, that will be set, and so on. Jenkins does track the causes of builds, so we get a fair amount of help from Jenkins there. And as we'll talk about later with the HTTP API, you have an option to modify those links as well. It also tracks downstream builds. So if you start a Jenkins build from another Jenkins build, in other words, an upstream-downstream relationship, it'll automatically set the cause so that the downstream build below here will have its activity triggered. It will have a cause link to the upstream build's activity triggered. As we discussed briefly during one of the sessions yesterday, we are looking into how this should be modeled. Cause is not really the right way of modeling this kind of relationship for various reasons. But I mean, the downstream build wasn't caused by the activity triggered event of the upstream build. That doesn't really make sense. So this should be some other way of expressing this relationship. But for now, this is what we do. Activity triggered events also have a data.categories member where you can add arbitrary strings that somehow describe your activity. And you can affect how these are set for your builds. There is a global setting and there is a per job setting that you can set either through the GUI or through your pipeline configuration. And those two lists of strings are merged. So, for example, you can have in your global config, you can set Jenkins as the category, and then every single Eiffel activity run from that Jenkins controller will have a Jenkins category, allowing, for example, visualization consumers to better understand the topology of your jobs, for example. And with this setting in your jobs, you can again describe much better what the job actually does. From your builds, you can also access the events that were sent, the activity triggered and activity started. So the JSON representations of those events are injected as environment variables in the build. So this small example here shows what it could look like. So you could use this if you want to emit events from within your builds. If you create an artifact and want to link it to your activity, or if you do something else, you can obtain the ID of the activity trigger or activity started. So that's pretty useful. So I briefly mentioned this earlier. If you trigger Jenkins builds from the outside through the HTTP API, or for that matter, if you trigger builds between different Jenkins instances, you might want to set various Eiffel-related links. Typically the cause, but it could also be a context link. So there is a new API endpoint for this, Eiffel/build, that's made available for all jobs. And it works like the standard build endpoint, supposed to be entirely compatible. There are probably some discrepancies. So you post a form containing parameters, if the job has any parameters, but also an Eiffel links key in the JSON object. So this is a literal example because these are form values. So it would be in a single line and it would be form encoded. So it would be completely unreadable. So I've pre-printed it for everyone's benefit. But this is what it could look like. So the build started from this request would then have a cause set to the ID here, and that would override any other cause that would otherwise be assigned. You can supply multiple links if that makes sense to you, or you can just leave out the Eiffel links key also, so you can use this API consistently for really all job start requests. So another feature is that you can send event from within your Jenkins pipelines. That's something we discovered when introducing Eiffel at Access, where we use Jenkins heavily, is that it was just unnecessarily difficult to set up your events and send them. Even if you have RAM available, so you can just make an API call, you still have to assemble the message, you have to set up the links correctly, and so on. And that was fairly tedious. And if it made sense to do that from within an existing script, say you had a Python script that performed your build, it was fairly easy to include this. But if everything you had was a Jenkins pipeline, then suddenly things became pretty difficult, because if you wanted to use more involved code, you would have to suddenly spin up a container with a small script of 100 lines that would assemble an Eiffel message and send it. And I mean, technically it's trivial, but it's pretty annoying, and it's not something that I enjoy asking people to do. So we added a new pipeline step called send Eiffel event. So you can assemble the event you want to send in Groovy code in your pipeline. You don't have to supply all fields. The ID, for example, will be automatically populated. The version will too, I think. So it works like this. You pass it to the send Eiffel event pipeline step, and it'll return the event, the JSON payload that was actually sent over the wire, which then could inspect to obtain the ID of the event, for example. It'll also add automatically a context link to the activity. You could opt out of that behavior, or you could set it to another link type, cause link, for example, if that makes better sense for your event. But by default, it'll be a context link, which is typically what you want to do, I think. Another matter that was a bit tricky is if you want to publish Eiffel artifacts from Jenkins builds. And I'll explain why that could be a little bit tricky. So During a build, you would have a setup phase where you clone source repositories and create various directories and whatnot. You would build everything, and then you would have a cleanup phase. Usually during the cleanup phase, that's where you would archive the artifacts in Jenkins terms. In other words, copy them to the controller and make them available. So it looks something like this probably if you want to publish Eiffel artifacts. So you would somehow from your build, either through a call to RemRem or the pipeline step that I just showed, you would send your artifact creation, your artifact published, and then at the end, you would have probably an archive artifacts pipeline step that would copy the files from the workspace on the build node onto the Jenkins controller and make those files available. Of course, the problem is during this time, the URLs in the artifact published event won't be available. You'll get a 404 error. This time could be, of course, quite short, maybe just a couple of seconds. But any consumer listening to artifact published events, they could react within 2 milliseconds and immediately hit the Jenkins server to download an artifact, and they would get a not found error. Fixing this is a bit cumbersome, actually. In some cases, you could just put the archival step earlier. You could do it, in between here. It depends on how, from where you're sending the events. If you're sending these events from a pipeline script, you could easily, probably at least, just put the archival step there. But if you're sending the events from deep within your build script, which is probably where you have the best knowledge about how to assemble the artifact creation. In other words, what files should go into this artifact, what are the tags these files should have, and so on. Then it's much harder to insert in the middle a separate pipeline step. And also another thing with this is the artifact published event isn't. It could be sent by Jenkins itself. It doesn't. The publisher doesn't really add any information there. It's just a pointer to the artifact created event and a bunch of URIs. Those are well known. So what we do here is same situation here. We send the artifact creation. We also write this event to a file in the workspace of the build node. And later on, we archive the artifacts, making the files available to consumers or clients. And then we have a separate pipeline step that would read the events.json file. It doesn't have to be named like that, by the way. It could have any name. To get hold of the artifact creation events. It would then see what files were part of that artifact, that Eiffel artifact. Make sure that all those files are actually present as artifacts, as Jenkins artifacts in the build, and then assemble the artifact published event for you and send it with the correct URIs. So publishing artifacts is just a matter of assembling the artifact creation message, and then the rest happens automatically, and there aren't any race conditions. So that's a pretty nice feature, we think. So let's take a look at what this could actually look like. So at the top, you would have code for building code, producing binaries, and you would somehow send the artifact creation and write the event payload. This could either be through a direct connection to the broker, or you use RemRem. Either way, just write the payload to a file. Some time passes by. You would use the standard archive artifacts to make the Jenkins artifacts available. And then you would use the publish Eiffel artifacts pipeline step and reference the events.json file. And then you'll have the artifact published event sent. Another case is if you send your artifact through the send Eiffel artifact. Oh, sorry, there's a typo here. I'm sorry. It says send Eiffel artifact here. It should say send Eiffel event. My bad. But if you use this method instead of sending your artifact creation event, like in the previous example, we just sent a composition defined event, you would assemble your event somehow and use the send Eiffel event pipeline step. But you also provide an additional argument, publish artifact, that you set to true. And this will record the artifact creation with the build, similarly to the events.json file that we looked at earlier. Then you archive the artifacts, and then you can just call the publish Eiffel artifacts. So it's the same thing really as the earlier example. The difference is the bookkeeping of the artifact creation events are done internally, and you don't need the events.json file. Also helpful when you're creating artifacts is help assembling the package URLs. There are some pretty intricate quoting and escaping rules for package URLs. Plus, doing that kind of stuff in general in a Groovy script and a Jenkins pipeline can be a little bit annoying, and it's probably easy to introduce bugs. So the create package URL pipeline step simply wraps the official package URL Java class. So just supply it with the components that go into the package URL, and you'll get back a string that you can then inject into your artifact creation event. And that was it. I see I have about 10 minutes here, so I can actually show you a little bit more what it looks like. See, I'll make that a bit larger. So I have a few demo jobs set up here. Oh, we could start with this publish event. This is mostly the same as in my slides, but it's nicer to see what it looks like. Well, here's the box for the activity categories. So again, you can configure it through your pipeline code, but you can also edit here from the GUI. So let's just type in Maven and my program like that. And let's see, we'll clear that. And we can look at the pipeline code. Very simple. We define a composition with just a name, and we'll send that. So let's save that and build and have a look at the log. And it'll tell you that it sent a message with this ID. And if we look at, we'll run that again. Yeah. So here you can see what was actually sent. So here's the activity triggered. It has the categories that we configured. It also has a trigger. So it indicated that we started by anonymous, which, well, I don't use authentication in my local Jenkins instance. It sends an activity started as expected. It has the link to the logs, the link to the build itself. And here comes our composition defined, exactly as we wanted it to be. This context link was added automatically. And at the end, we get an activity finished event. It was successful, and it has a persistent log link. Let's look at one more example, similar. So this is the part where we, yeah, let's actually use another example. Let's do this one instead. Yeah, so here's an example of how we send an artifact from the pipeline code itself. So here's the create package URL step to assemble the package URL, and here's the artifact creation event. And here we fake creation of this artifact, because again, when before it publishes, before it sends the artifact publish event, it makes sure that all the files referenced in the artifact creation events are actually available as artifacts. If they aren't, you'll get an error. So again, we assemble the event in the Groovy code. We use the send Eiffel event pipeline step with a publish artifact argument. We publish the Jenkins artifacts, and we publish the Eiffel artifacts. So let's try that out and hope things haven't broken since I ran this the last time. It looks to have worked. So here we have the artifact creation event. The artifacts, the Jenkins artifacts, are archived, and then based on that, it sends the artifact published for the artifact referenced up here. And if we flip over to here, we're going to see the same thing here. Here's the artifact published event with the URI to the my program tarball that we created earlier. That's pretty much for the features of this plugin. We have a number of other features lined up, including getting source change events correctly wired for causes, so that we use Garrett. So we want our Garrett trigger Jenkins builds to have the correct Eiffel links to the source change events produced by Garrett. That one will be a little bit tricky, of course. We also have some minor things we want to fix. We want to adapt to the new routing key standard that I talked about yesterday. We want to add domain support. Not that we use domains, but we should support it anyway. But anyway, we're using this in production, have been for quite some time, and it's been quite useful for us and our Eiffel efforts. Any questions? Other comments?
I can just say that I think that this looks very promising, and I think that we should make we should look into using this ourselves in Ericsson as well. I mean, we have our Jenkins plugin, but it's not really fully up to date to support Jenkins pipeline. A comment there maybe regarding where it's placed in GitHub. We saw also in Matthias' presentation yesterday on the landscape that it's actually placed outside the community GitHub organization, as it is a Jenkins plugin, I guess. Is that the only way to deal with it, or do you see any problems with having it outside the community? Could it be inside the community?
It could be. The benefit of having it there is you get a bunch of GitHub Actions CI jobs will just work automatically. I also suspect that if you want automatic publishing of artifacts, you might have a harder time if it's outside. But I mean, technically, of course, it's just a Git repository, so it could reside anywhere. But when the plugin was created, some 3 years ago, it was decided to do sort of, we thought it had a tighter association to the Jenkins community than with the Eiffel community.
I just think, I mean, we didn't do the same choice when we open sourced, or when we at least created the Jenkins project in the community GitHub for Eiffel for our plugin, which has not been open sourced, unfortunately. But anyway, so yeah, we need to consider that how we do it going forward. And of course, it needs to be visible in a good way in the community in a way that we have this plugin. And I guess we need to discuss how to maintain this plugin as well, if it should be maintained by the community or if it's completely separate. Such things.
Yeah.
But looks very good.
Anything else? All right, thank you.